At 7:15 in the morning on December 7, 1944, Second Lieutenant Leonard Lamel crouched behind a cold stone wall in the cemetery at Bergstein, Germany, staring across a wide field buried under fresh snow toward the steep mass known as Hill 400, while German machine gunners inside their concrete pillboxes adjusted their firing lines 400 yards away, preparing to cut down anything that tried to cross the open ground. Lamel was only 24 years old, yet already a battle-hardened veteran from the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on D-Day, now leading what was left of Dog Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion into an assault that 4 full divisions had already failed to complete. The Germans had turned Hill 400 into a fortress with a wooden observation tower at the top, concrete bunkers dug deep into the slope and interlocking fields of fire that dominated the entire Roer Valley below. From that height, German observers could see every American truck, every tank, every squad that moved across the valley floor. The 9th Infantry Division had tried to break the position in September and suffered 4,500 casualties just to gain 3 kilometers of ground. The 28th Division went at it in November and lost 6,000 men without gaining a yard. The 4th Infantry Division lost another 6,000 men in the first week of December. 3 days earlier, the 5th Armored Division had sent tanks toward the hill, and German 88mm guns smashed them before they even reached the tree line. Now only 120 Rangers from Dog and Fox companies were being asked to accomplish what thousands of regular infantry could not, and they would do it with no tank support, and only the limited artillery 1st Army could spare. Lamel had led a reconnaissance patrol at 3 in the morning, crawling to within 200 yards of the German defenses, counting pillboxes, marking machine gun nests, trying to memorize every threat on the slope. His scouting confirmed that the hill was defended by soldiers from the 980th Grenadier Regiment of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, veterans well supplied and dug into defenses they had spent weeks perfecting. Behind Lamel, Captain Otto Masny, the 6'3" commander of Fox Company, moved down the Ranger line, checking weapons, adjusting ammunition belts, giving quiet words to the men who had marched 2 miles through freezing rain after arriving at Bergstein at 2 that morning. The plan was brutally simple. Dog Company would hit the right side of the hill, Fox Company would attack the left, and Easy Company would remain in Bergstein as reserve. The Rangers would have to cross 400 yards of open field, climb a slope that rose at 45 degrees, break into the bunkers on the summit, and then hold against the inevitable counterattacks the Germans would launch. Lamel knew the odds. At Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers had climbed 90-foot cliffs under fire and lost nearly a third of their force in the first hour, yet still held for 2 days. Every man in Dog Company remembered that fight, and everyone understood that this one would be far worse. The air was 28 degrees, and the earth was frozen solid, which meant digging foxholes at the top would be nearly impossible. The slope was crowded with fir trees, and German artillery would likely airburst rounds above the treetops, turning the forest into a cloud of splinters and shrapnel. At 7:25, American artillery opened the assault. 18 batteries fired in sequence 105mm shells, then 155mm shells, then massive 240mm rounds. The bombardment crept up the slope in sections, shaking the ground beneath the Rangers and throwing soil and timber into the sky. Lamel watched the impacts through the dim morning light, saw trees explode, saw bunker roofs shudder under direct hits, and knew the barrage would suppress the defenders but not destroy them because concrete and deep earthworks could endure heavy fire. When the barrage shifted at 7:28 to strike only the summit, that was the signal for the Rangers to advance. Lamel looked left and right, saw men fixing bayonets, saw final checks on grenades, felt the familiar weight of the Thompson submachine gun against his chest with its 30-round magazine and 2 spares and 4 fragmentation grenades. It was the same load he had carried at Pointe du Hoc. At 7:30, Captain Masny rose behind the cemetery wall, and the Rangers followed. 120 men moved forward in 2 waves, stepping into the snow without a shout, letting only the echo of artillery ring across the valley. The plan relied on speed. They needed to cross the field before the Germans recovered from the bombardment, reach the tree line, and push up the slope before the enemy could reorganize. But at 150 yards, the first German machine gun opened fire, an MG-42 tearing bright traces across the field. The gunner had survived the barrage and stayed at his post. Rangers dropped some hit, some diving for cover, while others kept pushing forward. Lamel saw Private William Anderson fall 30 yards to his left, saw Sergeant Ed Secker dive behind a shallow rise, saw Fox Company, taking fire from another position on their flank. The run that was supposed to take 2 minutes had already become 4, and each second allowed the Germans to bring more weapons into action. At 200 yards, German mortars began to fall preset rounds from 81mm tubes, exploding in patterns across the field. The first salvo landed short, but the next walked toward the advancing Rangers. Still, they moved because stopping in the open meant death. Private Kenneth Harsh took shrapnel across his face at 100 yards, but kept running with blood soaking his collar. A replacement soldier froze and curled into a ball, and Lamel saw other Rangers move past because the assault could not stop for anything. Lieutenant Ken McClure took a bullet through his right leg at 75 yards, sank to one knee, yet continued, directing his men forward, refusing to leave until every man in his platoon had passed him. At 50 yards from the tree line, Captain Masny was hit in the shoulder, but stayed upright, pushing his company forward. At 7:33, the Rangers reached the edge of the woods after crossing 400 yards under fire with 14 men killed or wounded. They spread out among the trees, breathing hard, while mortar rounds continued to pound the field behind them. Lamel looked up the steep slope, rising ahead 45 degrees and 400 feet of climb, with bunkers 60 yards above, and voices shouting orders in German. The artillery had shifted to the summit, leaving the mid-slope unprotected. Small teams would have to lead the way using the brutal method they had trained for in Scotland, England, and France. Grenades first, bayonets second. At 7:35, Dog Company began climbing. The second wave of mortar shells crept closer as the Rangers pushed deeper into the trees, but no one stopped because every man understood that halting meant dying in the open. Forward movement was survival. Private Kenneth Harsh, with blood sliding down his jaw from the shrapnel that had torn into his cheek, kept climbing without hesitation, while behind him a young replacement collapsed onto his knees, frozen by fear, and curled into himself as explosions shook the ground. Lamel saw the moment, but he could not stop because every second mattered, and the assault had to continue no matter who faltered. On the left flank, Lieutenant Ken McClure dragged himself forward with a bullet lodged in his right leg, refusing evacuation and shouting orders to keep his platoon moving until the last of his men had passed him. 50 yards up through the trees, Captain Masny took a hit in the shoulder, but absorbed the pain and continued pressing Fox Company upward, his field jacket already soaked with blood. These men had fought through Sicily, Cerno, and Normandy, and none of them were willing to stop on this slope. At 7:33, the Rangers finally reached the tree line after the brutal 400-yard crossing, leaving 14 men dead or wounded behind them in the snow. Inside the woods, they found a few moments of cover against trunks and fallen logs, where breath mixed with freezing air, while German mortars tore apart the field they had just crossed. Lamel looked up the slope that rose almost straight above them, 400 feet of frozen earth, studded with fir trees and fortified German positions. The closest bunkers sat about 60 yards above, and he could hear enemy voices carrying orders down the hillside. American artillery was now focused on the summit, leaving the midsection silent and dangerously exposed. The climb would not be a coordinated advance, but a series of small team actions, each group of 3 or 4 pushing ahead while the others covered them. Lamel gathered his platoon of 32 Rangers pointed up the slope and reminded them of the method drilled into them from training grounds in Scotland, England, and France. Grenades first, then bayonets, then follow through until the bunker was cleared. At 7:35, the ascent began with Dog Company moving straight up the right side while Fox Company advanced on the left. The ground was frozen slick with snow and ice forcing the Rangers to grip roots, branches, and tree trunks to pull themselves upward. German machine guns opened fire from the bunkers above, sending rounds, snapping through the trees, throwing bark and splinters into the air. The forest vibrated with the ripping sound of the MG-42, and the Rangers climbed faster using the chaos and the uneven ground to stay alive. Private Anderson reached a low concrete bunker about 70 yards up. Its firing slit faced directly down the slope, and the MG barrel inside spat fire into the forest. Anderson pulled 2 grenades, yanked the pins, and hurled them into the opening, then dove behind a thick tree trunk. The double explosion shook the slope, and when the smoke cleared, the machine gun was silent. On the left, Sergeant L. Rod Petty led his Fox Company squad with the precision of long experience, using bounding movement to advance. 1 man fired short bursts while 3 men rushed forward. They reached a pillbox at around 80 yards with a heavy steel door barring entry. Petty shoved the muzzle of his Browning automatic rifle through the firing slit and unloaded a full 20-round magazine into the darkness inside. The return fire stopped immediately. 100 yards above the slope narrowed, and the Rangers encountered triple-strand concertina wire stretched between trees to block the most direct path to the summit. German engineers had placed the wire exactly where the terrain funneled attackers, forcing them to choose between detouring into exposed flanks or cutting straight through under fire. Lamel chose through. He pulled wire cutters from his pack, dropped to his knees, and began slicing through the thick metal coils, while Sergeant Tom Ruggiero fired uphill to keep German heads down. Cutting each strand took agonizing seconds, and mortar shells began falling again. The 81mm rounds burst above the treetops, spraying shrapnel and wood fragments. A Ranger behind Lamel screamed when a shard tore through his back, and he collapsed across the coils. Lamel kept cutting, fighting numb fingers and the sting of splinters across his jacket as a German grenade bounced near them. He dropped behind a log. The grenade detonated, flinging sharp timber into his clothing, though none pierced his skin. He stood back up and continued cutting. First belt finished second belt, next third belt after. At 7:48, nearly 18 minutes after the assault had begun, Dog Company finally tore through the last strands of wire and reached the final open stretch toward the summit. Through the battered trees they could now see the observation tower rising above the crest, a dark wooden structure sitting atop a concrete base. German troops moved between positions, shouting urgently as they scrambled to reorganize. The sound of diesel engines grinding up the rear slope confirmed that armored support was coming. Assault guns were being brought to the summit. The Rangers had minutes at best before German armor arrived. They climbed faster. Hands dug into frozen soil, boots slipped against ice sweat, steamed through fabric despite the cold. German rifle and machine gun fire intensified the closer they drew to the top. Fox Company on the left advanced in parallel, taking heavy fire, but maintaining their push. At 8:35, 1 hour and 5 minutes after leaving the cemetery wall, the 1st Rangers reached the summit of Hill 400 and broke into the German defensive ring. The view stretched across the Roer Valley, but there was no time to admire it because the Germans were still very much present and fighting. The main bunker stood ahead with a steel door sealed shut. Private Anderson reached it first, heard boots, and shouted commands from inside and kicked the door, but it did not move. He pulled a grenade, held it 2 seconds, and tossed it at the door. It bounced back toward him, and he dove for cover. The blast tore into him, and he died before Captain Masny could reach him. Lamel arrived moments later, saw Anderson lying still, saw the door still intact, and saw muzzle flashes from the firing ports. He shoved the barrel of his Thompson through the nearest port and emptied the entire 30-round magazine in one burst. The machine gun inside went silent. Masny arrived with 6 men from Fox Company, their commander still bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound. 2 Rangers slapped satchel charges against the hinges, lit the fuses, and sprinted backward. The explosion ripped the door inward, and the Rangers charged. Inside, they found 12 German soldiers, 8 dead from the earlier burst, and 4 wounded who surrendered immediately. By 8:40, the Rangers stood in control of the summit, having taken 28 prisoners and killed around 40 defenders. They had lost 16 Rangers in the assault, and another 23 were wounded, leaving 81 men atop the hill. But holding it would be far harder than taking it. They all knew it, and the German engines approaching from below confirmed that the real battle was only beginning. By 8:40, the Rangers held the crest of Hill 400, but the victory brought no relief because it was a shattered landscape of churned earth, splintered trees, and smoking bunkers, and every man on that ridge knew that the Germans would counterattack the moment they regrouped. The diesel engines heard during the ascent still growled somewhere below the reverse slope, promising the arrival of armored support that the Rangers were not equipped to handle. Lamel tried to dig a foxhole, but after scraping aside 2 inches of loose soil, his entrenching tool struck frozen ground that refused to budge. The earth was too hard to carve, and that meant the Rangers would have to fight from whatever positions the Germans had already built. It was the worst possible circumstance because those positions had been designed to fire outward, not to defend from the direction of the valley where the Rangers were now exposed. Lieutenant Howard Kettle Hutt arrived at 8:50, climbing through the broken trees with 2 enlisted radio operators. He was the forward observer from the 56th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, and his job was to coordinate every gun in range to support the Rangers. He climbed into the 2nd level of the observation tower, set up his radio, and immediately began calling defensive fire missions. His calm, precise voice carried coordinates into the headset, while below him, the Rangers scrambled to form a loose defensive line across the hilltop. Lamel walked the ridge at 900 hours to assess their position. The summit stretched roughly 400 yards long and 200 yards wide, shaped like an uneven oval. Shell craters marked the places where American artillery had smashed the ground earlier. The air smelled of explosives, pine resin, and smoke. The Rangers spread out along the forward crest facing south and southeast because that was the direction from which the Germans would strike. The reverse slope offered some protection, but it also exposed them to artillery batteries further down the valley. Sergeant Ed Secker gathered ammunition from captured German positions, collecting 3 MG-42 machine guns, 15,000 rounds of linked ammunition, and 20 stick grenades. He redistributed the supplies, giving every Ranger more magazines and spreading grenades across the line. Experience from Point Du Hoc had taught them that ammunition was the true lifeline in a prolonged fight. If they ran out, they would not survive. At 9:15, the first German artillery barrage began. The opening salvo came from 105mm guns striking the southern slope, then rolling up toward the summit. The second salvo hit the crest itself. Shells burst overhead, sending clouds of shrapnel through the battered treetops. A Ranger near Lamel took a shard through his helmet and fell without a sound. Lamel dragged him into a bunker, but the man was already dead. The bombardment lasted 10 minutes, and by the time it ended, 3 more Rangers had been killed and 5 wounded. When the barrage lifted, Lamel knew what would come next, and seconds later, he saw movement in the tree line 300 yards below. Through the drifting smoke, German infantry assembled into assault formations, guided by officers shouting orders. He counted around 150 men from the 654th Grenadier Regiment, forming in 3 waves of 50 with 20 yards between them. It was standard German assault doctrine. The first wave would draw fire, the second would exploit gaps, and the third would consolidate any breach. At 9:35, the first German counterattack began. Lamel had positioned Dog Company on the right side with 30 men and Fox Company on the left with 25. The remaining Rangers filled the gaps or manned the captured bunkers. Every man had a clear line of sight down the slope. Every man knew to hold fire until the enemy reached 100 yards. Lieutenant Kettle, hut in the observation tower, called the 1st Artillery mission, his voice steady as he corrected the fall of shot. 3 American batteries, 18 guns fired in response. The shells walked down the hillside, exploding in front of the advancing Germans. The first barrage landed at 200 yards, the next at 150. Still, the German first wave advanced, stepping through smoke and debris. At 100 yards, Lamel shouted the order, and the Ranger line erupted with fire. M1 rifles cracked in rapid sequence. Browning automatic rifles sent bursts through the vapor. The captured MG-42s unleashed devastating streams of bullets at over 1,000 rounds per minute. German soldiers fell in the snow, some tumbling backward, some crawling behind trees to return fire. The wave faltered but did not break. At 75 yards, the second wave emerged through the remnants of the first and split into 2 groups attempting to flank both Ranger companies. Lamel shifted 5 men to reinforce the right flank. Secker moved 3 Rangers to the left, and together they directed their weapons into the flanking parties. Concentrated fire tore through the German maneuver, and the survivors retreated downhill. Grenades rolled from Ranger positions at 50 yards, filling the slope with sharp exploding echoes. The German line buckled, and by 9:42 7 minutes after the assault began, the first wave began falling back. The 3 waves withdrew, leaving dead and wounded strewn across the hillside. The air hung heavy with smoke shouts and spent gunpowder, but the Rangers had held. The cost, however, was grim. 4 Rangers dead, 7 wounded. Only 70 Rangers remained fully capable of fighting, and everyone knew the Germans would come again. At 9:50, Lamel conducted another ammunition count. The numbers were bleak. Each Ranger averaged around 40 rounds. The BR gunners held only 2 magazines each. The MG-42s had about 3,000 rounds, and the grenades were nearly gone. Major George Williams, the battalion executive officer, reached the summit at 10:15. After climbing from Bergstein to assess the situation. He saw 70 exhausted wounded men trying to hold 400 yards of exposed hilltop against an enemy regiment, and he immediately radioed for reinforcements from the 8th Infantry Division. But he also knew reinforcements would take hours to arrive. The Rangers would need to withstand whatever the Germans planned next. At 10:30, German artillery returned heavier than before. This time 155mm guns rained destruction across the summit, smashing trees, breaking open bunkers, and showering the Rangers with splinters and debris. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, killing 2 more Rangers and wounding 4. The survivors clung to whatever cover they had as shells punched into the ground around them. At 10:50, the bombardment stopped, and through the drifting smoke, Lamel saw new movement down the slope. This time the scale was larger and more ominous. 200 infantry moved into position, and behind them crawled 3 assault guns, probably Stugs, their thick armor glinting through the haze. The second German counterattack was coming, and the Rangers had almost nothing left to stop armored vehicles. At 1100 hours, the assault began with the Stugs taking position 300 yards down the slope to deliver direct fire. Their 75mm guns were powerful enough to destroy any Ranger shelter with a single hit. Dog Company held one of the only 2 bazookas on the hill, led by Sergeant James White, who had 6 rounds to face 3 armored vehicles. He positioned himself behind the broken wall of a bunker, waiting for the assault guns to draw closer. The infantry advanced in 4 waves with 50 men per wave, using better spacing than earlier. Officers blew whistles to coordinate the movement. German mortars began dropping rounds on the summit, and machine guns in the trees opened fire on Ranger positions. Lieutenant Kettle Hutt called for every artillery battery in First Army to fire. The response was enormous. Dozens of guns hammered the hillside. The barrage was violent and dense, exploding through rows of advancing Germans, but still they came pushing through the gaps in the fire. At 200 yards, they went prone and began returning fire. The Stugs advanced to 150 yards. Sergeant White fired his bazooka at the front plate of the leading assault gun. The rocket streaked downhill, struck the armor and detonated, but the heavy plate held. The Stug immediately turned its gun and fired at White's position. The 75mm round exploded against the bunker wall, knocking White unconscious, but miraculously not killing him. The second bazooka team struck the side of the trailing Stug, igniting it, and forcing the crew to bail out only to be shot as they fled. The burning wreck blocked the narrow track, forcing the remaining 2 Stugs to reverse down the slope. The German infantry had lost their armored support, but they continued climbing with grim determination, closing the distance step by step. The Rangers prepared to fight at close quarters again because they knew the second German assault was about to crash into their line. The German infantry pushed upward in disciplined waves, determined to reach the Ranger line even without the support of their assault guns. And by 11:15, the leading elements were only 100 yards from the crest, moving through the bodies of those who had fallen before them. The Rangers opened fire with everything they had left. M1 rifles cracked in controlled rhythms. Browning automatic rifles sent short bursts across the slope. The captured MG-42s spat chains of rounds that ripped through the advancing troops. The fire was devastating, but still the Germans kept coming, stepping over shattered branches and fallen comrades, climbing with grim purpose toward the summit. Lamel watched them press forward through smoke and snow. The second wave closed to 75 yards, spreading out. As it reached the tangled remnants of the wire the Rangers had cut earlier. German officers shouted from behind, urging their men to push even harder. More Germans moved to the flanks, trying to break around the Ranger line and catch them from the sides. Lamel signaled 5 Rangers to shift right to counter that maneuver, while Sergeant Secker moved 3 men to the left. Concentrated fire raked the flanking attempts, stopping them just short of success. The main German assault continued, pushing straight up the hill, leaving a trail of wounded and dead in its wake. At 11:20, the 4th German wave surged forward, reaching 50 yards from the Ranger line. These men fixed bayonets as they advanced, preparing for hand-to-hand combat. Behind them, Lamel could see more troops gathering deeper in the trees, evidence of a possible 5th and even 6th wave waiting to exploit any breakthrough. The Rangers were exhausted and low on ammunition, but there was no thought of retreat. Each man understood that yielding the crest even for a moment would allow the Germans to overrun the entire position. At 11:22, German officers blew whistles signaling the final push. 100 German infantry rose from behind cover and charged straight at the crest with bayonets ready. They screamed as they climbed the last stretch of the slope, firing from the hip. The Rangers met them with point-blank rifle fire, firing until magazines ran dry. Grenades were gone. Ammunition was vanishing. At 10 yards, combat dissolved into chaos. The clash became hand-to-hand, a brutal struggle of fists, rifle butts, and blades. Sergeant Secker had been firing his Browning automatic rifle until a German bullet struck the weapon and bent the barrel, destroying it. Without hesitation, Secker dropped the ruined gun, scanned the ground, and spotted 2 dead German soldiers a few feet away, both holding MP-40 submachine guns. Secker grabbed both weapons, one in each hand, raised himself out of his foxhole, and began firing from the hip, walking forward through the assault line. The Germans hesitated, stunned by the sight of a single Ranger charging them with 2 submachine guns blazing. Secker emptied both magazines, spraying rounds across the assault line. When the MP-40s clicked empty, he tossed them aside, seized a German rifle from another fallen soldier, and kept fighting. His charge ignited the Rangers behind him. Men who had been crouched low rose and followed him into the fight, driving the Germans backward. the German fourth wave broke under the unexpected counterattack. They retreated down the slope, leaving 30 bodies on the hilltop. The Rangers pursued them for about 50 yards, but exhaustion and dwindling ammunition forced them to halt. They could not chase the enemy any farther. At 11:30, the second German counterattack ended. 200 German infantry had climbed the hill, and 140 had been killed or wounded. The survivors fled to the tree line below, leaving the slope littered with bodies, weapons, and broken branches. The cost to the Rangers was terrible. 12 more Rangers lay dead and 15 were wounded. Only 43 Rangers remained fully capable of fighting. At 11:40, Lamel conducted another ammunition count and found that most men had no more than 20 rounds. The BR gunners were down to their last magazines. The MG-42s held around 1,000 rounds. Almost every grenade had been used. They had barely enough ammunition for another fight. Major Williams gathered the remaining Rangers at 11:45 and told them reinforcements from the 8th Infantry Division were on the way, but the earliest they could arrive would be late afternoon. The Rangers needed to hold for at least 5 more hours. No one spoke. Every man understood the challenge. At noon, Captain Walter Block, the battalion surgeon, arrived with 2 medics carrying limited medical supplies. He set up an aid station inside a captured bunker and immediately began treating the 23 wounded men who lay scattered across the summit. He moved with quiet precision, stabilizing the worst cases and preparing them for evacuation whenever help came. At 12:15, German artillery returned again, this time heavier than ever. Shells from 155mm and 240mm guns crashed across the entire summit. Trees that had survived the earlier bombardments shattered under the force. The ground shook constantly. Splinters larger than daggers sliced through the air. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, turning the hilltop into a moonscape of overlapping craters. At 12:20, a massive shell smashed directly through the roof of Captain Block's aid station. The explosion inside the bunker killed Block, instantly wounded both medics, and buried several wounded Rangers beneath collapsed concrete and debris. For 20 agonizing minutes, the surviving Rangers clawed through rubble to free the trapped men. 3 more died from their wounds before they could be pulled out. At 12:45, the shelling finally stopped, and for a moment the summit was strangely quiet. Lamel scanned the slope, expecting another German wave to emerge through the smoke, but the tree line below showed no movement. No shapes gathering, no officers, signaling no shadows creeping forward. The absence of enemy troops was worse than seeing them. It meant the Germans were planning something far larger. At 1300 hours, Lieutenant Kettle Hutt received a radio message that confirmed their fear. German reinforcements were on the way. The 6th Parachute Regiment, a full battalion of elite German paratroopers known as Volksjägers, had been ordered to retake Hill 400. 600 of the best infantry the Germans possessed were forming up 3 miles to the south, and were expected to reach the base of the hill by mid-afternoon. Field Marshal Walter Model had personally authorized their deployment and promised Iron Crosses, and 2 weeks of leave to any soldier who helped recapture the hill. Lamel gathered the remaining Rangers, just 43 men, now most of them wounded, all of them exhausted, low on ammunition, and shaken by the relentless artillery. He explained what was coming. 600 elite paratroopers advancing directly toward them. Williams asked the question that had been burning in every mind. Could they hold until reinforcements arrived? Lamel looked at the men around him, saw the bandages, the torn uniforms, the blood caked into collars and sleeves, the hollow but determined eyes. He gave the only honest answer. They would have to try. At 1500 hours, the 3rd German counterattack began. 600 Volksjägers advanced in disciplined waves, 100 men at a time spread 50 yards apart. Their assault was supported by mortars, machine guns, and coordinated artillery fire. These were not the already battered grenadiers of the morning. These were fresh, determined elite troops, and they were coming to take the hill no matter the cost. The Volksjägers advanced with a precision and discipline that immediately distinguished them from the earlier German assaults. These were elite troops, trained for rapid, coordinated attacks, and they moved across the southern slope in a methodical pattern that allowed them to absorb losses without losing momentum. The first wave of 100 men pressed forward using the terrain, skillfully dropping to the ground whenever American artillery struck, then rising again to climb during the momentary pauses. Behind them, the second and third waves adjusted their positions using whistles and hand signals, while mortars from the valley rained shells toward the summit. The Rangers watched from their shallow positions, spread thin across 400 yards of hilltop. Only 43 remained combat effective, and many of those were wounded. Ammunition was dangerously low, but every man stayed silent, focused on the dark figures moving through the smoke below. Lamel had divided what little ammunition they possessed, giving priority to the Browning automatic rifle teams and the crewmen manning the captured MG-42s. Each Ranger was told to hold fire until the enemy reached 100 yards, because anything fired earlier would be wasted. Lieutenant Kettle Hutt continued calling artillery while perched near the shattered observation tower. At 500 yards, he ordered defensive fire missions from every battery within 1st Army range. The response came swiftly. Dozens of guns hurled 105mm and 155mm shells onto the slope. The explosions ripped apart trees and sent fire sweeping across the hillside. But the Fallschirmjägers were trained to move through fire. They flattened themselves against the earth during the heaviest bursts, then rose and advanced in squads leap, frogging from one patch of cover to another. At 300 yards, the German artillery began counter-battery fire, striking at American gun positions in the valley. Some batteries went silent. Others continued firing, but less accurately. The pressure on the Rangers increased as the German infantry steadily approached. The first Fallschirmjäger wave reached 200 yards around 1515 hours. Lamel gave the signal, and the Rangers began firing. M1 rifles cracked across the crest. BR spat controlled bursts. MG-42s tore corridors through the advancing lines. The Germans dropped to the ground, returning fire instantly. Their marksmanship was deadly. Within the first minute, 2 Rangers fell lifeless and 3 more were wounded. The second wave moved through the casualties of the first at 150 yards, maintaining their advance without breaking formation. Their fire was relentless, forcing the Rangers to crouch low behind broken logs and chunks of frozen earth. The Germans moved with a chilling level of coordination. One squad fired while another crawled forward, preparing to rush. Mortar shells burst above the hilltop, sending shrapnel spiraling downward like metal sleet. At 1520, Sergeant Ed Secker took a piece of shrapnel through his left shoulder. Blood soaked his jacket, but he stayed in position, firing through the pain. His rifle had already chewed through 2 full sets of magazines taken from wounded and dead Rangers around him. He was down to his last 8 rounds, but he continued picking targets with careful precision. Around him, other Rangers shouted for ammunition or crawled to the bodies of fallen comrades to collect spare clips. At 1525, the German third wave reached 100 yards. The Rangers threw their remaining grenades, rolling them downhill into clusters of advancing troops. The explosions tore gaps into the assault line, but the Fallschirmjägers continued pressing forward. The fourth wave was already moving through the smoke behind them, taking advantage of every crater and fallen trunk for cover. The Germans had numbers on their side. They could sacrifice entire squads and still overwhelm the ridge. The assault now came from multiple angles. Some troops advanced directly up the slope, while others worked toward the flanks, testing for weaknesses along the thin Ranger line. Lamel saw German soldiers cutting through the wires near 75 yards and shouted for reinforcements. But he had almost no men to spare. The Rangers were stretched to their limit. At 1530, a full German squad slipped through a shallow gap on the left flank, using the reverse slope to circle behind American positions. 10 Fallschirmjägers climbed toward the summit from the blind side, ready to sweep the Rangers from the rear. Lamel grabbed 5 Rangers and sprinted across the ridge. They met the German squad head on inside a massive shell crater where visibility was limited, and the distance between the 2 groups narrowed to a few feet. Lamel raised his Thompson and emptied a magazine into the Germans, killing 3 immediately. His men joined in firing their rifles point blank. 7 more Germans fell. The survivors stumbled backward down the slope, leaving the ground stained and littered with gear. The near breakthrough showed how thin the defensive line had become. Major Williams moved between positions, coordinating movements and calling wounded men back into cover. His calm voice steadied the Rangers, but even he could sense the line weakening as casualties mounted. At 1535, Williams received a radio message that threatened to break morale entirely. The reinforcements from the 8th Infantry Division had been delayed. German artillery had struck the approach road, destroying several vehicles and forcing the column to reroute. They would not reach Hill 400 until evening, possibly after nightfall. Until then, the Rangers were alone. Williams made his decision instantly. He ordered every Ranger to hold position no matter what. If ammunition ran out, they were to fix bayonets. If bayonets broke, they were to fight with entrenching tools. There would be no withdrawal. They would either hold the hill or die on it. At 1540, the German 5th Wave reached 50 yards. These troops fixed bayonets and surged forward with terrifying speed. Behind them, the 6th Wave advanced in tight formation, ready to exploit the final breach. Lamel looked at his Thompson and saw only 1 magazine left with 15 rounds inside. Around him, Rangers shouted that they were down to their last bullets. The final assault was minutes away. The Fallschirmjägers gathered behind shattered trees ready to charge. Rangers braced themselves among ruined stumps and broken bunkers. No one spoke. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer against the frozen air. By 1545, the Germans began their charge. 500 Fallschirmjägers sprinted up the final stretch, firing from the hip bayonets gleaming. The Ranger line trembled under the weight of approaching footsteps. This was the decisive moment, and they all knew it. The Fallschirmjägers erupted from the smoky tree line at 1545, sprinting up the final stretch of slope with fixed bayonets and rifles blazing from the hip, while the exhausted Rangers braced themselves behind shattered logs, broken bunkers, and shallow scrapes of frozen earth. 500 elite German paratroopers charged in a roaring wall of bodies and steel, and every Ranger on the summit fired their remaining rounds into the oncoming mass. M1 rifles snapped until bolts locked back empty. BR spat their last bursts. The captured MG-42s hammered streams of fire until barrels smoked and ammunition belts dwindled. Men counted shots, yelling last magazine or 2 rounds left, trying to ration every bullet, because once ammunition was gone, their only defense would be bayonets, rifle butts, and bare hands. Lieutenant Kettle Hutt saw the Germans closing to 30 yards and called for the most dangerous artillery support possible. He requested danger close fire missions, placing American shells within 50 yards of the Ranger positions. The artillery batteries responded without hesitation. The entire valley shook as 105mm and 155mm rounds crashed down among the charging Germans. Explosions ripped through the front ranks, throwing bodies into the air and slicing through the tightly packed waves. Shrapnel tore through uniforms and splintered trees. Both sides suffered losses as fragments sprayed across the crest, but the barrage shattered the momentum of the German charge. The Fallschirmjägers dropped to the ground 12 meters below the Ranger line, taking cover among craters and broken limbs. They fired upward relentlessly, turning the crest of the hill into a storm of muzzle flashes and ricocheting bullets. The battle settled into a brutal stalemate, with Germans only 30 yards away and Rangers holding the summit by sheer determination. For 2 hours, neither side could advance nor retreat. Every man fought when he saw the slightest movement through smoke or snow. Germans crawled forward in small squads, trying to inch closer. Rangers shot whenever they glimpsed a helmet or rifle barrel. Mortar rounds from the valley continued to hammer the summit. In return, American artillery struck the slopes below, pounding assembly areas and supply routes. Snow mixed with black earth, forming a grey slush that stank of cordite and blood. Sergeant Ed Secker, despite the shrapnel wound in his shoulder, continued fighting from a shallow depression near the right flank. His rifle was nearly empty, so he scavenged ammunition from fallen Rangers, grabbing clips from pockets and belts. His face was streaked with dried blood and smoke, yet he kept firing with precise discipline. Around him, several Rangers did the same, crawling between bodies to recover ammunition because there was no resupply and no alternative. At 1590 hours, a group of Fallskärmjägers attempted to flank the right side, moving low across the reverse slope. Lämmel saw the maneuver and shouted orders. The remaining Rangers shifted to block the move, engaging the Germans at close distance. Rifle shots cracked, mingling with the dull thud of grenades, though both sides had few left. The Germans retreated after taking several casualties, but the attempt revealed how desperately they were trying to break the line. No one on either side spoke much now. Breath came out in white clouds. Hands shook from exhaustion. Every Ranger knew they were holding the hill by threads of courage and will. At 1600 hours, the Germans launched another coordinated push, sending fresh troops up the center, while others fired suppressive bursts from the flanks. Rangers responded with whatever ammunition they had left. Some had only 3 or 4 rounds, some had none. One Ranger broke the heel of his rifle from repeated blows against helmets and skulls. Major Williams crawled along the line, encouraging men, repositioning fighters, shifting them from crater to crater, to plug the gaps and keep the line from collapsing. At times, Williams fought beside them, firing his own weapon until it was spent, then grabbing another from the ground. As the sun sank, lower frost formed on jackets and helmets. The air turned colder with each minute, yet sweat still steamed through torn sleeves as the Rangers strained to hold back the relentless assault. At 1630 hours, a small group of Germans reached a section of the crest only 10 yards from the Ranger line. They charged forward in a desperate attempt to break through. Lämmel grabbed his Thompson with its last handful of rounds and rushed forward with 3 Rangers beside him. He fired into the advancing Germans, dropping 2 before the weapon clicked empty. The remaining Germans lunged forward and the fight turned savage. Rifle butts smashed into helmets, blades clashed, boots slipped on frozen mud. Somehow the Rangers held the tiny breach, pushing back the attackers through pure grit. A dead German slid down the slope, leaving a streak of dark red in the snow. At 1700 hours, the fighting ground down into a painful, slow exchange of fire as exhaustion spread across both lines. The Germans no longer surged in mass. Instead, they crawled forward in scattered pairs, shooting whenever they saw a shadow or movement. Rangers responded in the same way, firing only when absolutely necessary because ammunition was almost gone. Some men had only 1 bullet left saved for the closest threat. Kettle Hut kept adjusting artillery missions, though his voice cracked from shouting over explosions. The gun crews continued firing shells down the slope, trying to stall any regrouping efforts. The Germans began dragging wounded away under the cover of smoke and twilight, but many lay where they fell, unable to move. The land was a twisted battlefield of shattered bodies, scattered weapons, and trees stripped to bare splinters. At 1730 hours, something changed. The American artillery barrage intensified sharply. Shell after shell detonated across the southern slope, smashing staging areas and hitting German support teams. The pattern was different from the earlier defensive fire. This was not harassment fire. This was a massive coordinated bombardment. The Rangers looked to the north, hearing movement in the forest below the slope. Figures appeared climbing steadily. Reinforcements, fresh troops from the 8th Infantry Division, around 200 strong, arrived at the summit carrying full ammunition and heavy weapons. They moved into positions beside the Rangers, extending the line and strengthening the defense. For the first time that day, the pressure on the Rangers eased. German troops saw the American reinforcements gathering at the crest, and their final advantage of numbers vanished. At 1815 hours, the Fallskärmjägers began to withdraw, slipping back down the southern slope through smoke and fading daylight. Their attack had failed. Their regiment was shattered. The brutal struggle for Hill 400 had reached its end. The Rangers had held. They had endured 3 massive counterattacks, a day-long bombardment, near starvation of ammunition and overwhelming odds, yet the hill remained in American hands. The ground around them bore the scars of the fight. 23 Rangers lay dead, 86 were wounded, and only 11 remained fully able to stand without support. But they had done the impossible. They had held Hill 400 against everything the Germans had thrown at them. Darkness settled slowly over Hill 400 as the last echoes of battle drifted into the battered forest, and the surviving Rangers tried to comprehend what they had endured. The Fallskirmjägers had withdrawn, leaving bodies and broken equipment across the slope, along with a silence that felt unreal after 10.5 hours of relentless fighting. The hilltop was a wasteland of shattered trees, cratered earth, and blood-soaked snow. Smoke drifted low over the ground, mixing with the icy wind. Yet the Rangers remained standing, though only barely. Most men were wounded in some way. Bandages stained red, helmets dented, uniforms torn, eyes hollow from exhaustion and shock. Still, they held their rifles, gripping them tightly, as if another wave might suddenly rise from the darkness below. For minutes no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery echoing across the Roer Valley, and the low groans of the wounded waiting for evacuation. Lamel stood near the remains of the observation tower, staring across the southern slope, where hundreds of German bodies lay scattered in rows, reflecting the moonlight like pale stones. He felt no triumph, only an overwhelming fatigue and a sense of disbelief that his men had survived this long. The fight had begun before dawn, when the world was grey and frozen, and now night wrapped the hill in deep shadow. Almost an entire company of elite German paratroopers had been thrown against them, yet the line had held. Lamel knew the cost had been devastating. 23 Rangers killed, 86 wounded, several missing. Of the original 120 men who had started up the slope at 7:30, only 11 were still able to stand and fight without assistance. That number struck him harder than any blow he had taken in the battle. They had been asked to seize and hold a hill that 4 divisions had failed to take, and somehow they had done it. As reinforcements from the 8th Infantry Division spread across the summit, bringing fresh ammunition and supplies, Lamel walked the perimeter with slow, deliberate steps. He checked on each surviving Ranger, listening to their stories of narrow escapes and desperate shots. Some could barely speak. Others sat silently staring into the distance, unable to process what they had endured. Medics from the reinforcing unit began to treat the wounded, carrying men to safer positions and preparing them for transport down the northern slope. Captain Masny lay near a crater, resting against a broken log, 2 wounds bandaged but still alert. He gave Lamel a weary nod. Secker leaned against a tree trunk, his uniform torn, his shoulder wrapped in a bloody sling, his rifle resting at his side. His eyes were half closed, but he forced a faint smile when Lamel approached. The man had fought like someone possessed and had nearly sacrificed himself multiple times. Every Ranger had a story like that. Every one of them had displayed courage far beyond expectation. Around 1830 hours, crews from the 8th Infantry Division helped secure the summit. They established firing lines in case the Germans attempted a night assault and set up temporary shelters for the wounded. Fires were forbidden because the glow would draw artillery. The temperature dropped sharply and the wind cut through clothing like a knife. Rangers tucked their hands into sleeves or pressed them against their bodies to preserve warmth. The pain of cold mixed with the shock of battle created a numbness that settled deep into their bones. At 1900 hours, evacuation teams began moving the wounded off the hill. The descent was slow and treacherous. The path was slick with snow and mud, and the wounded groaned with each step or jolt of the litter. Some men asked if the Germans would attack again. Others whispered that they had no strength left even to fear. Lamel remained on the summit until every wounded man had been taken down. He walked the ridge once more, staring at the places where his Rangers had stood through each assault. Here the bunkers they had seized at 8:40. There the gap where Fallskirmjägers had nearly broken through. The crater where Secker had fired 2 MP-40s at once. The battered slope where German bodies lay in heavy clusters. It felt surreal to see the battlefield so still after the hours of chaos. Sometime near midnight, Lamel finally allowed himself to rest for a few moments inside a small captured bunker. His body ached, his face burned from cold, a cut on his arm throbbed without pause, yet he could not sleep. The images of the day replayed endlessly in his mind. At dawn on December 8th, he was evacuated from the hill, suffering from a concussion and metal fragments lodged in his arm. Before being taken down, he insisted on walking the summit one final time. He paused at the place where Private Anderson had fallen, then at the destroyed bunker where Captain Block had died trying to save wounded men. He stopped at each position where Rangers had held through impossible odds. He remembered their voices, the shouts, the gunfire, the explosions, the final push of the Fallschirmjägers. He remembered the fear and the resolve. Only when he felt he had seen everything did he allow the medics to escort him down the slope. The Rangers were relieved by the 13th Infantry Regiment on December 9th and moved back into the Hürtgen forest to a temporary bivouac area. They had hoped for rest, but rest did not come. 9 days later, the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, and the Rangers were rushed to the northern shoulder to help stop the offensive. They were not given replacements. They were not given time to recover. The 70 men who survived Hill 400 would fight through the Ardennes and later push into Germany itself, carrying the memory of December 7th with them into every new battle. In late December, the Germans retook Hill 400 during the early days of the Bulge, overwhelming the depleted 13th Regiment. American forces did not recapture the hill until February 1945, but by then its strategic value had faded. The German offensive had failed, and the Allies were advancing steadily across the Reich. What mattered was not the hill itself, but what the Rangers had proven on that freezing morning. Military historians later described the defense of Hill 400 as a textbook example of small unit leadership and courage under fire. They wrote that the hill had been saved by the bravery, the intelligence, and the determination of junior leaders and the men who followed them. Lamel would live 75 more years, and when people asked him about D-Day, he always gave the same answer. June 6th was not his longest day. December 7th, 1944, was the day burned into his soul, the day he never forgot, the day when 120 Rangers held Hill 400 against everything the Germans had and refused to break. The story of Hill 400 did not end when the guns fell silent on that frozen evening, nor did its weight fade from the men who survived the ridge. The battle carved itself into their memories like an unhealed wound, a reminder of the cost of holding ground that other units had been unable to take. Even after reinforcements secured the summit and stretcher-bearers began their slow descent toward Bergstein, the hill felt alive with echoes of the violence that had consumed it. Smoke drifted through the trees long after the last German shot. The scent of burning oil and shattered earth lingered in the cold air. The Rangers who remained stood among the ruins like ghosts, unsure whether to feel triumph, grief, or disbelief, that they had lived through a day that should have killed them all. Medics and infantrymen from the 8th Division made their way across the ridge, shining dim flashlights through the gloom, calling out for survivors in low voices. They found wounded Germans as well, some begging for water, others too far gone to speak. The Rangers offered aid where they could, though their own supplies were nearly spent. War had stripped away hatred, leaving only exhaustion and a quiet understanding that every man who bled on that hill had been fighting for something he believed in. The living moved carefully among the fallen, stepping between rifles' helmets and bodies half buried in snow. Lamel, though dazed from his concussion, insisted on walking with the rescue teams, pointing out positions where men had fallen, where bunkers had held, where the lines had nearly broken. He wanted to make sure no one was left behind. It took hours to gather the wounded. The path down the northern slope was narrow and treacherous, the ground churned by artillery and slick with ice. Litter bearers slipped more than once, catching themselves with bare hands against jagged roots. Some wounded pleaded to be left where they were, believing they would burden the rescuers, but the Rangers refused. No man would be abandoned on this hill they had fought too hard to hold. When dawn broke on December 8th, the first rays of sunlight revealed the full devastation. The slope where the Fallschirmjägers had charged looked like the surface of another planet littered with shattered trees, cratered soil, and hundreds of bodies scattered like dark shapes across the white snow. The observation tower, now a broken skeleton, cast long shadows over the summit. The bunkers still smoked from satchel charges and grenades. The hill had become a symbol of the brutality of the Hurtgen campaign, a place where the terrain itself seemed to fight alongside the Germans. As evacuation continued, officers from higher command arrived to inspect the hill. Their faces hardened when they saw how few Rangers remained. They had expected casualties, but the sight of an entire elite battalion reduced to a handful of surviving fighters left even seasoned leaders speechless. News of the battle spread quickly through the surrounding units. Soldiers who had fought in other sectors approached the wounded Rangers with quiet awe. Many had heard rumors that the Rangers had taken the hill in one morning, but had not believed they could hold it against repeated counterattacks, including a full assault by elite paratroopers. Now seeing the men themselves thin, pale, wounded, but still standing, they understood the truth. The Rangers had done something extraordinary. On December 9th, the 13th Infantry Regiment officially relieved the Rangers on the summit. Trucks and jeeps carried what remained of dog and fox companies back into the Hurtgen forest, where they set up a bivouac among trees, shattered by weeks of fighting. The men collapsed into makeshift beds, wrapping themselves in blankets stiff with frozen mud. They did not talk much. Some slept instantly. Others stared upward into the branches, unable to escape the echo of machine guns in their minds. The doctors who examined them wrote similar notes in every report. Extreme exhaustion, severe shock, multiple wounds, dehydration, frostbite, and psychological trauma. But there was no rest for the Rangers. Only 9 days after the fight for Hill 400, the Germans launched their massive winter offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. American lines across Belgium and Luxembourg bent under the weight of the surprise attack. The Rangers, still battered and without replacements, were sent to defend the northern shoulder of the Bulge. They fought again in freezing forests and snow-filled villages, holding back German armor and infantry, with the same stubborn resolve they had shown on Hill 400. They continued through the Ardennes, through the Rhineland, and into Germany itself, carrying with them the memory of the hill and the friends they lost there. In late December, the depleted 13th Regiment was unable to hold Hill 400 against the renewed German push, and the hill fell back into enemy hands. American forces did not retake it until February 1945, by which time the tactical value of the hill had diminished. The German army was in retreat, the Bulge had failed, and the Allies were advancing across the Reich. The hill no longer mattered strategically, yet its legacy remained carved into the hearts of the Rangers who had seized and defended it under impossible conditions. After the war, military historians studied the battle closely. They wrote that Hill 400 demonstrated the value of elite light infantry in missions where speed, precision, and aggressive leadership mattered more than numbers. They described the Rangers as an example of what highly trained units could accomplish when properly led, even when outnumbered and outgunned. Textbooks on military tactics still reference the battle as a case study in small unit leadership. Interviews with surviving Rangers years later revealed how deeply the experience shaped their lives. Some rarely spoke of it at all. Others described flashes of memory so vivid they felt transported back to that morning when they first stepped from behind the cemetery wall into the snowy field. Many said that they felt the presence of those who had fallen whenever they thought about the hill. Lommel especially carried the day with him for the rest of his life. When asked in later years about D-Day, he always surprised people with his answer. June 6, 1944, had been terrifying and historic, but it was not his longest day. It was December 7, 1944, the day he led 120 Rangers across open ground, climbed a 45-degree slope under fire, broke through bunkers, held a ridge for 10 hours, and watched nearly all of his men fall around him. That day stayed with him in a way no other day of war ever did. He said that Hill 400 had taught him the true meaning of endurance, the weight of leadership, and the unbreakable spirit of the Rangers who fought beside him. Long after the war ended, long after medals were awarded, and documents archived the story of Hill 400 endured. It lived in the memories of the Rangers who survived, in the quiet respect of the units that followed, and in the history books that recorded their stand. It became a testament to courage under fire, to unity in crisis, and to the idea that even the smallest group of determined soldiers can hold the line when everything depends on it. Hill 400 remained a scar on the land, but it also became a monument to the men who refused to yield a single step, even in the face of overwhelming force. Their legacy endures not because of the ground they held, but because of the spirit with which they held it. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.